Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We were giving you all time to connect. We know what it's like. You plan to connect at 11 sharp, but then, there's always something happening and everybody is really operational a couple of minutes later. So we've had those 2 minutes. So let's kick off this morning's webinar. And welcome to the launch of our first assessment report on sea level rise in Europe. Now, before we dive into the heart of the matter, could you please allow me a few housekeeping remarks? First of all, we would like to invite you to use the chat function to connect with one another. You can introduce yourself to the other participants, you can interact between you and start a dialogue. But please do not use the chat function for the Q&A. You will have time for questions to our speakers at the very end of the webinar. So we will hear all our speakers making the presentations, and then at the end, we're saving some time for a Q&A. And you are invited to send your questions throughout the discussion. You should, of course, say who you are, but also say who the question is for, if it is for anybody in particular. The questions will be monitored, and at the end of the session, we will raise them as much as possible, time allowing, of course. One other point, this webinar is recorded, and the video will be shared, will be made available through the Knowledge Hub on Sea Level Rise, through the JPI Climate and JPI Oceans websites, and through their social media channels. So there are going to be quite a few ways of reconnecting or hearing again, viewing again some of the interventions. Let's now focus on the contents. And contents there is quite a lot of, because it is an absolutely essential report that we are launching today. It's a milestone report for our Knowledge Hub. In fact, this report is a joint initiative from the Joint Programming Initiatives, on the one hand, for connecting climate knowledge for Europe, that's the JPI Climate, and on the other hand, the initiative for a healthy and productive seas and oceans, that's the JPI Oceans. The report gathers the work of over 70 leading scientists, climate scientists, marine scientists, and it is supported and overseen by 9 European countries, namely Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Ireland, the Netherlands, Norway, Spain, and Sweden. The report was also just published in the State of the Planet. That's a new journal format published by the Copernicus publications, and it is dedicated specifically to report format. So you will also be able to find it there. The report was co-directed by Nadia Pinardi from the UN Ocean Decade Center for Coastal Resilience and Bart van den Hurk from the IPCC Working Group 2. And both of them will be with us here today to present their work. The report presents an authoritative analysis, and it was developed in order to support policymakers, practitioners, and coastal planners across Europe. So it is a practical report with recommendations and with a lot of analysis behind it. The report also contributes to the Equinox process. And the Equinox process was launched by, or not the Equinox process, but the Equinox process was launched by the JPI Climate last year, and it is supported by the European Commission Magica project. So what's the Equinox process? Well, it aims really to accelerate the transfer of climate knowledge from science to policy and practice. So it is a very concrete initiative to bring science to concrete measures. This first assessment report also contributes to the UN Ocean Decade for Ocean Science, in which JPI Oceans serves as decade implementing partner. So there are quite a few implications to the report, and that's also what makes it essential. So let's now turn to our contributors. And I would like to introduce the various speakers who are going to be joining us today. We will, of course, welcome Nadia Pinardi, Professor of Oceanography at the University of Bologna, and Bart van den Hurk, who is the co-chair of the IPCC Working Group 2. And I've already mentioned the two of them because they were the co-directors of the reports. Joining us as well, we have José Jiménez from the Polytechnic University of Catalunya, Gundula Winter from Delta-Res, Angelique Mellet from Mercator Ocean, Roderick van der Waal from Utrecht University, Giulia Galluccio from the European Mediterranean Centre on Climate Change, and Sandy Bizarro from the Global Climate Forum. Welcome to you all. It's a pleasure to have you with us, and we're very happy that all of you could contribute to the presentation of the report. Nadia, I'd like to turn to you first, because I'll invite you to set the scene really and tell us more about the Knowledge Hub as the ocean climate nexus. How do they all interact? So over to you, please.
Thank you, Florence. And welcome everybody here, and good day, good night, good evening, or good morning. So I'll try to share now my screen. Yeah. So let me see if I can. Yes. You should see my screen. So here we are after 4 years of hard work, and it is an emotion to see that, you know, really we achieved what we were thinking at the beginning would be a platform, a starting platform for Europe to inform the policymakers and the practitioners of what is happening for sea level rise along the coast of Europe. So, as it was already well explained by Florence, the Knowledge Hub on Sea Level Rise is a joint initiative by JPI Climate and JPI Oceans in support of European policy and coastal planning. It promotes interdisciplinary exchange and knowledge synthesis, which is what, you know, was at the basis of the work that we did. The Knowledge Hub on Sea Level Rise focuses on regional to local sea level changes and extremes in Europe, and foster the involvement of policymaking, scientists, engineers, social scientists, and coastal planning sectors. Aims at providing periodic regional assessments tailored to European policy and stakeholder needs, and offer accessible, regularly updated data on sea level rise impacts and adaptation options. One important, crucial part of our work was to start with JPI Climate and JPI Ocean and our governing council to structure in a transparent and as widely as possible collective effort the governance of the process. So myself and Bart and the secretariat from JPI Ocean and JPI Climate, I hope we will thank very much at the end of this presentation. They were essential components. We were working with a management committee composed of task groups that were working groups, actually, capable of addressing the key issues around which the Knowledge Hub on Sea Level Rise assessment report would have been based. So the first one is the co-design. Our first task group very important. It was the major effort in the first 2 years. The task group 2, which was also addressing policy issues of extreme importance, and then the science-based task group 3, which is part of the endeavor of getting science-based policy advice, policy recommendations. And then the task group 4, which helps us to get in touch with more users, more stakeholders. And so we had more than the task group working, people. We had continuous interactions with other stakeholders, contributing authors of different kind. So the first assessment report is, we believe, a key resource of practical scientific insights for climate change adaptation mitigation. It is focusing on the basins around Europe, provides regional specificity, assessing projections and drivers of sea level rise impacts. Beyond rising waters, explores compound floods, flood erosion patterns, and shoreline changes, proposing solutions, among others, nature-based approaches. It goes beyond physics, encompassing marine spatial planning options, methodologies for assessing risk, and consideration of risk perception. The scoping process and the timeline has been extremely intensive. And we were all driven by the idea that we could really compose a regional IPCC-like board and platform for addressing the local needs of European stakeholders, supported by the member states contributing to the Governing Council and advised by them. So in 2020, countries nominate the experts of the tasks, the chairs, and we formed the Knowledge Hub. In 2021, we composed the details of the 4 task groups. And in 2022, we had a very intensive phase of co-design. First, and above all, the stakeholder survey, very important. Jose will talk about this as very important step of our process. Basin-specific workshops, also very important. We will hear more later. And then Sea Level Rise Conference that augmented our consultation with a variety of stakeholders in a synthetic way, drafting the ideas, the main scope of the assessment report. Then 2023 and 2024 was the hard work by the task groups to draft the key scientific survey that compose our first assessment report. And in 2024, we completed the process by an open discussion, the review, and the publication in the State of the Planet journal, which offered a wonderful opportunity for such report. And so after this, we like to think that we have set a road for the future. And we would like to go for user feedback survey, which will assess the report and will tell us what are the gaps. It will align the report, the future reports, with more stakeholder needs, identifying outstanding knowledge gaps that were not yet addressed in the first assessment report. And we will also go through an internal compliance analysis trying to understand where internally the knowledge gaps and our organizational gaps were, trying to ameliorate. And then trying to start the new cycle. And with this, I thank you all for the attention, and I leave the floor again to Florence, I guess.
Thank you, Nadia. Thank you. I actually have a couple of questions for you to maybe go into a little more detail on your presentation. What were for you the key elements, the key ingredients for the delivery of the report?
Thank you, Florence. I think that key ingredients of our report, which I find particularly significant, first of all, are the consultation that we had with sea-basing stakeholders, the survey, the co-design. We did it really in an innovative way, trying to go from scientists to coastal managers and policymakers. And that was achieved all around Europe. The science-based approach, which is clearly the key element of such assessments, climate assessments, and the internal and external reviewing process that we undergone to arrive at the final version. So these are the three key that I can think of. And I would say that the most original and unique, Europe is the first one. Europe is the first giving that, in addition to the IPCC report, is the consultative process that we went through, which I hope it will be strengthened in the future.
Thank you. And do you think there's still anything in particular missing from the report at this stage?
Yeah, well, we started, but there are some key points, if you allow me to say. In my opinion, two are the major shortcomings of the present report. The first is the analysis of how the regional assessment on sea level rise could allow to better achieve the SDG targets for European member states. Sustainability targets and indicators related, for example, to goal 14 or 13, the climate and life below water, do not particularly mention sea level rise. They integrate sea level rise into broader indicators. But this experience has told us that we need specific indicators and that we need to concentrate on specific impacts. And so maybe we need to think to change SDG targets and indicators for sea level rise. The second shortcoming is the missing feedback from the practitioner community, which will come only in the second part, which we announced, which will be the evaluation of our process on the basis of the result of the assessment report itself, and the future consultation with coastal community to arrive to a full completion. We've started the process. We are very happy to have done this, and this is a major, I think, step forward. But we hope that this will be only the beginning.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nadia. And I'd like to remind you all that Nadia will be available for questions at the end of the session together with all our speakers. So don't hesitate to send your questions already now. Bart, I'm going to turn to you now because, as I said, you were the co-director behind the report. And it is really essential. I mean, it's one of the goals of the report to help policymakers to understand the key messages in the report so that they can develop the appropriate measures. So can you maybe give us a summary of these messages towards policymakers?
Yes, Laurence, thank you very much for the invitation, and also great to see that there's indeed so many people here. Yeah, I think we designed this process also with a cross eye towards the IPCC process. Quite a few people involved have been authoring or coordinating authoring in earlier IPCC assessments, including a special report on cryosphere, for instance. And there we already learned how important scoping is. So indeed, as Nadia illustrated, we took a lot of time for that to harvest the questions. And we also learned how important it is to pay credit to science, that we do not want to bring in things that cannot be substantiated by literature, but also how important it is to package the results into a digestible summary for policymakers. And those are typically, say, IPCC principles that we impose. I will briefly guide you through this summary for policymakers, but bear in mind this is a summary of the underlying report itself. So much more content is going to be covered in subsequent presentations by the chapter authors, but it gives you a flavor, I hope, of what's there to do. I'll share my screen. So as we indicated, this summary of this Knowledge Hub assessment report is considered to be giving additional value to existing IPCC-like global reports, but also additional value to, say, more regionally oriented reports by, taking a single assessment procedure, so to say, but to indeed zoom in, particularly to ocean areas or basins, as we call them, that are particularly relevant to stakeholders. So we structurally divided the whole assessment into these basins that you see here, where in many of the chapters, the Black Sea, Mediterranean have been combined for obvious reasons. But also in the summary for policymakers, we retained that structure because we believe that if anyone is going to look for information that's going to be relevant for that local context, you go to the basin that actually neighbors your country. And that is also imposed here. As we said, there is a lot of attention to scoping. We have a dedicated chapter that will be explained by José what kind of activities we did regionally. Again, basin-oriented workshops revealed a lot of, on one side, information from scientists that they think is going to be relevant for an assessment report like that. And you see a word cloud of, say, the scientists' take on relevant topics in the left word cloud. But on the other hand, in the scoping sessions, we also gave floor to the, say, practitioners or stakeholders, governmental entities that actually raised their question, point at the information needs, so the required question, the demand. And there you see that's that word cloud on the right is going. And say the word regional projection stands out in both. And I would like to emphasize the regional part of this thing. But there's also quite a lot of other entities that are overlapping, like things like uncertainty or the ice sheet contributions. But there's also differences in the scoping purpose. Then we went on with four main chapters. One of the first of them pointing at the sea level rise and observations and projections. And in the summary for policymakers, you see a couple of headline statements at the beginning, and the top paragraphs is just a quote from that for this particular section. Which actually points, of course, at the immense regional variability of sea level rise, also some gradients in the mean sea level rise, also related to vertical land motion, that of course in the high end of Europe is higher, but also related to the contribution of ice masses, but also related to oceanic dynamics and etc. So there is a lot of variability. I've used a figure actually from chapter 1 to illustrate what actually the information use of is by the different regions, and then particularly in the stakeholder area. And then you see that In the left-hand figure, you see that there is a lot of observationally based tidal records that are being used, global projections, regional projections. Some entities use, say, a fixed value for sea level rise for their planning or projections. And you see that these global projections are still dominant. The red colors are still dominant. Regional projections are next dominant, but you also see a bit of variability across the basins. I skipped the chapter on impacts, although there is a lot to say, but I do want to point out, and maybe that's going to be referred to as by the speakers as well later, but we had three categories of impacts covered, which is, of course, flooding, it is erosion, and it is saltwater intrusion. Originally, we also had a topic on ecosystem impacts of sea level rise, and in the end, we decided not to go for that because we couldn't really find enough, capacity and literature to make it a coherent topic. So we decided to leave that out. But I would say that in the next version of this assessment report, this impact side can definitely deserves an upgrade, I would say. An interesting chapter on the adaptation options or the response options. There's and this table is also going to be shown later, but I like really the systematics and the extent of the enormous amount of literature that exists for Europe that actually describes and prototypes a different set of categories of adaptation options according to, say, a systematically categorized set of options like accommodate or respond, whatever. What's also obvious from this chapter is that sea level rise, of course, is very often, a topic that needs attention together with other things. There's different challenges that come at the same time. Multiple objectives have to be met at the same time. Also, objectives in different time windows have to be met at the same time. Objectives at short time and long time may not always be consistent. And I think this chapter quite nicely sketches the complexity of actually the decision landscape in adaptation. And then finally, the chapter on governance is looking at sea level rise as a topic that actually deserves attention as a climate hazard, but actually as a chronic hazard. It's actually a slow hazard, a slow onset thing, which has quite a bit of a different dynamics on how it is governed than when we look at drought hazards or extreme rainfall or something like that. And but also here a couple of governance principles have been assessed quite systematically, like how justice is treated in governance arrangements, what kind of vulnerability can be distinguished, and some others. And I guess Sandy is going to allude to that. So this is really just a snapshot. There's much more in the summary itself. That's only 10 pages long, but of course the underlying reports are much bigger. Yeah, in the evaluation that is about to come out, we really hope to see what the uptake of this report is going to be. We probably have to wait a year or so before we can do a bit of sensing on that, I would say. But I'm really keen to learn indeed from stakeholders whether this is, adding is a resource that is adding to the already existing material. It would be great to learn from that. But I stop here. Thank you, Florence.
Thank you very much, Bart. And indeed, that's going to be my question, because there are other assessment reports and that have been made by other organizations like the ICCP, of which you're part, but also by regional initiatives, such as those taken in the Baltic or in the Mediterranean basins. So what does this particular report add to the overall picture?
Yeah. Well, I guess it again gives a comprehensive analysis for all European basins and uses a similar protocol. And so it is actually a time, a time sample, a temporal sample of the current state of knowledge, but for all basins at the same time. So it synchronizes. Many of the other assessments actually don't only look at sea level rise, but have a lot of other, say, oceanic dimensions in their assessment, like ecology or tourism or all kinds of economic factors like fishing, etc. This assessment is really focused on sea level rise, which also made it a bit more feasible, of course. I think it does add to, it actually foresees in an assessment of this continuous stream of literature that is coming out, and actually a continuous stream of an updated questionings that we come out of policymaking as well. So I think it's in that sense it's complementary that it is another time mark, but also really dedicated on the sea level rise across Europe, which also makes sense to do for, say, European decision making by the European Commission and by multilateral agreements, etc. But I am also curious to hear from potential stakeholders to testify what this did. This is pretty much, well, it's scoped intensively together with stakeholders, but it's produced primarily by the scientists in the team. And with all good intentions, we do hope that it does serve a purpose.
Thank you very much, Bart. And indeed, Bart has already touched upon the contents of the chapter, of the various chapters, but we're now going to go into more detail with the various authors of the different chapters. And I'd like to first focus on the knowledge gaps that have been identified. We saw some already in the slides that Bart shared, but let's go into a little more detail, and I'd like to turn to Jose for that particular part. Good morning, Jose.
Good morning, Florence. Good morning, everybody. So I am going to share my screen. Okay. Okay. So good morning. So I am going to show you one of the first steps that we did in all this process, that was to take an idea about what is the kind of information that the people have around Europe regarding sea level rise, regarding all the aspects, because in fact, so we have many reports, many data, but we are not sure if the people are able to reach this and how they are using it. So before to start to provide information, so we adopted a bottom-up approach in which we start by analyzing what the people need and which are the existing gaps regarding the sea level rise information. So we approach to this process in 3 consecutive steps. So the first one was to make a online survey extensive to everybody across the European basin. So we did this through internet, and we received 200 participants that gave their opinion in 3 main aspects regarding sea level rise information, data availability, regarding sea level rise impacts, and regarding sea level rise adaptation. Once we have the surveys, so we move to a second step where we launch 4 different workshops where we concentrate stakeholders from the different European basins. So in this case, so we maintain a 2-day workshop where we make some kind of roundtable where everybody participate in these 3 topics, giving their opinion and identifying the main gaps to be covered in the process. When we talk about people, we are talking different kind of stakeholders that we group in 2 main groups: government and research. So as you can imagine, so here we have a distribution. So most of the people were belonging to the research institute, but we have a 33% of the people participating in the surveys belonging to the administration. So we have a good view of what the people involved in policy planning have an opinion about which were the gaps in information to be filled with our assessment report. We did all this process across different basins. You can see here in this graph, which was the distribution, and most of the people that were attending were from the North Sea basin and from the Mediterranean basin, and unfortunately, so we have a very low participation from the Black Sea and from the Arctic Sea. So we hope that in the near future to increase this kind of participation. So which were the results? So the first one was to identify the main gaps in data information. So the first question that we asked, if you miss some data that this is useful for your work. So here we have for the different basins, which is the answer from all the stakeholders from each basin in a scale from 1 to 5. The lower the number means that they have all the information, the closest to 5, so means that they miss information. Just to give you an idea, about the 30% of the older people identify that they have some gaps in information in order to develop the projects or the policy planning or any work related to civil-rights information. So even that we have a huge amount of information in research journals, in reports, and so on, so still the people involved in civil rights, so they take some gaps. When we talk about which are the information that you're using, it's the same graph that presented Bart a few minutes ago. So then the most available information was the global projection. So you can see here, and here we have for all the basin. If all the color along all the basin were the same, so it means that there is an homogeneous distribution of information, as you can see here. So depending on the basin where we are, so then we have a much more available information or a much more useful information. So we detect that there is not an homogeneous response of the people, neither in the research group, neither in the people involved in policy basins. So the accessibility of the data and the use of the data was also different. And in addition to this, we also asked the people which are the main gaps that you identify. So that here you have the different response from scientists and government, and the size of the work. It is indicating how frequent this was identified. As you can see, so the people are asking especially for regional projection and local projection, and also appeal very highlighted the topics related to uncertainty. So this will be the common gaps, but in a different frequency depending on the basin and depending on the type of stakeholder. Once we have this information about the data existence, so we move to the impact, and we ask for all the basins again, which was the most important impact induced by sea level rise according to the work of the perception. So we included a list of typical impact, and the most identified, you can see here, there was quite homogeneous across all the basin, was coastal erosion. So for all the people participating in the workshop, all the people participating in the survey, so identify coastal erosion as the most important impact regarding sea level rise. So inundation is important, the increase of the stone impact is important, but the most important for the people, or the most relevant for the people that they identify the most common, was shoreline erosion, and this was pretty constant along all the basins. So in the other impacts, you can see that there is a difference in the response, that we assume that this is also related to the geomorphological and socioeconomic characteristic of each basin, where each impact is affecting in a different way. But again, this can be used in order to have a profile of the people in the different basins. Here, once we have this, say, okay, if these are the impact, how are the impact assessment related to sea level rise that you have in your sites? Are they of high quality or not? So again, if we are going close to 5, so they are of high quality. If they are going to 1, so they are not of high quality. As you can see, so the people, the average number was 3, so it means that the people say, okay, it is more or less good. But of course, so if we divide into the 2 different groups, the 40% of the people from the academia say that there is a miss of high quality impact assessment, and if we go to the government, so they were quite much more optimistic. So only the 29%, the 30% identify that they need high quality impact assessment. So here again, so we have a difference between the different type of stakeholders. But again, not all the information, it is available for all the people, even that we have a huge amount of information. And finally, so we move to adaptation. And now we ask to the different stakeholders regarding the adaptation plans existing to the different countries. So then we ask about the effectiveness of the adaptation plans, and also regarding the flexibility. The most frequent answer is that the existing adaptation plans are insufficient to deal with the impact of sea level rise, and they are not flexible enough. So here again, so this is the most, the arrow is indicating the most answered qualification, but again, so we have some difference between the different basins. And finally, so we also ask which are the issues where you have to make decision where you are not using sea level rise, but you think that you have to include. So here we have the response for the scientists and for the government. Some of the items are the same, but in different level of importance. So one of the things that this is emerging is that the people are aware that in order to properly manage coastal ecosystem, so we have to include information regarding sea level rise. So all this information came from the survey, and then we integrate in order to prepare the workshop. So from the workshops, we organize the workshop again around the three main topics: information, impact, and adaptation. Here you can see some highlights obtained from the different workshops. So here we are integrating the workshop from the different sides. So the most important from the information is that still that we have data. It is now for the people they are not reaching to all the data, so especially locally on the regional level, so there is an insufficient climate data, especially for estuaries and areas that are important for humans. So the people need high resolution data, especially locally, and the people also are aware about which is the interaction between sea level rise and the future of extreme event, that the impact of these extreme events will be enhanced by sea level rise. In terms of impacts, so the people need to include the combined effect of hazard according to floods, erosion, and so on, induced by sea level rise to integrate into the assessment. And also that this is important to maintain a catalog. So nowadays, 1 week ago, we have a very huge flood event in Spain, and now everybody is aware that we have this type of event, but this is important to record and to maintain a continuous catalog of all the historic events in order to make good decisions. And finally, regarding adaptation, so there is a need of the people identify that this is important to have a good idea about which are the methods that we have, and also to compare between countries in order to learn one from each other. And finally, it is also similar to this process itself that was a bottom-up. So all the stakeholders say that this is important, especially for adaptation, is to involve the community in the adaptation processes. Just few take-home measure is that the survey workshops,
Jose, I'm sorry. Can I ask you to really wrap up as quickly as possible?
Yeah, no.
Thank you.
This is just to say that the process was very important to identify the real gaps. It is important to see the different views and perception, and also that in terms of adaptation, so the people are, we have significant doubts about the current effectivity and flexibility of the current plans. So thanks. It is enough.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Just a very quick answer to this, but it really seems that it was essential to involve the stakeholders in the preparation of the report, right? I mean, it's already been mentioned by Nadia, it's been mentioned by Bart. Is that something that you really felt throughout the process?
Yeah, it's very, very important, because we detect that the information that reach the different stakeholders across Europe is very different. Even that all this information is available for everybody, so the information is not reaching. And the needs from the government, research, administration, on the different stakeholders is pretty different. If we want to be effective in order to transfer the information with the assessment report, so we have to address all the points raised by the different type of stakeholders, and everywhere across Europe, not just for someone in the Mediterranean, someone in the North Sea, but we have to fulfill all the requirements across Europe.
Thank you very much. And to continue digging a little deeper into the substance, I mean, clearly all these results have given rise to quite a few observations, but also projections that are made in the report. And to tell us more about those, I'd like to turn to Angélique. Angélique, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I wanted to share my slides, and for that I need the sharing to stop first on Jose's side, I guess.
Jose, can you please stop? Yes, thank you.
All right, so hello everyone. I'm very happy to present this chapter that I co-led with Roderick van der Waal, and as you see, I would like to acknowledge the several authors contributing to this chapter on observations and projections. So to start with past and present sea level rise, we have first looked at satellite altimetry providing the absolute sea level changes. So first you can see the global mean, absolute sea level change, and you can see the acceleration that we get over the past decades. And then we get the regional side of that, focusing on Europe on the right side. And you can see that over Europe, mainly, there is a consistent upward trend, so sea level rise, in a basin average sea level that is slightly overall above global mean sea level rise for the altimetric era. We can see as well variability in sea level trends in the different basins, with, in that case, higher sea level, geocentric sea level in the Baltic Sea, and only very few areas for European seas showing no change to a slight decrease, and those areas would be the white ones in the figure. But of course, the sea level that really matters in terms of impact is that we can feel also on land, for coastal population and assets. So for that, we also need to take into account vertical land motion. And we have some illustration here for Europe, where we can see vertical land motion in terms of trains, millimeter per year, with GNSS stations, and with the part due to the glacial isostatic adjustment pattern in the middle panel. And we can see that in terms of vertical land motion, there are some hotspots of subsidence in Europe, so including in Venice, in the Wadden Sea, so those areas basically. And we do see the uplift of the northern part of Europe, Scandinavia. And this is mostly related to the glacial isostatic adjustment. So when we take the two into account, so the geocentric sea level and the vertical land motion, we do get the relative sea level rise trends that you can see from tie gauges on the right-hand side. And we see that those patterns, so only focusing at the coast here because they are provided by tie gauges observations, we do see a more contrasted picture, including a relative sea level fall in the end in the Baltic Sea because the area is uplifting. Now, looking into the future, those are the projections of relative sea level changes by 2100 relative to the past decades, using two different greenhouse emission scenario, a low emission one and a very high emission one. And we see with this focus on Europe that relative sea level will rise throughout the 21st century over European seas, mostly, with some exceptions that we can see in the northern Baltic Sea with the bluish colors, and in some parts of the European Arctic Ocean, where the relative sea level will fall. And this is, again, mostly because of JIA. So this is broadly in line with global mean projections, which would give roughly 40 centimeters of sea level rise under low emission and 80 centimeters under very high emissions. But we do see some patterns there, and we see especially north to south gradients with a larger sea level rise in southern parts of Europe. We can look at things a little bit differently as well with the timing at which certain thresholds of sea level will be reached in the future. So we have here the two same scenarios, and we have different thresholds, 50 centimeter, 70 centimeter, and 1 meter of sea level rise. And we do see consistently with what was shown before that sea level will rise faster in Southern Europe than in Northern Europe. That if we focus, for instance, on the Mediterranean Sea, under a high emission scenario, a 1 meter sea level rise will occur in the 2120s to 2130s in this area. And it's also important to acknowledge that sea level is committed to rise in the upcoming centuries to millennia in European seas because of the large inertia of the deep ocean and because of the ice sheets. Finally, most of the impacts are also occurring during extreme sea levels, so we would like to provide this snapshot of the projected changes in extreme sea levels that will be reached more and more often in the future. And to illustrate that, we look at the historical 1 in 100-year sea level event, so the historical centennial event, and how much more frequent it will be by 2100. So we see that mostly we go towards, so if it doesn't change in terms of frequency, we have this nude color, let's say, and we, in most places of Europe, we go towards yellowish to reddish colors, meaning that extreme sea levels will be reached much more often in the future. And this is exacerbated in the southern parts, so including the Mediterranean Sea, where you can see those reddish colors, meaning that what we experienced only once every century on average in the past will be reached almost daily by 2100 under this scenario, which is, by the way, the middle of the road emission scenario, not even the very high emission scenario. So with all of that, we see that we would need more adaptation to sea levels. We need also more local information on sea level rise and on drivers of extreme sea levels. And I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angelique. And I mean, you've mentioned some aspects, but I'd like to hear from you what the key uncertainties and the key knowledge gaps are for the sea level rise in Europe, from what you have identified.
All right. So in terms of uncertainty, there are different sources of uncertainties, obviously, for the projections. One is just dedicated to the socioeconomic pathways that we will follow as a society. So in terms of emissions, because we do see that depending on the scenario and the narrative that we consider in terms of emissions, we have much different projections. Another one that has been highlighted several times is related to the behavior of the ice sheets. And if we will reach tipping points and when, and the overall amplitude of this contribution for a certain horizon. So we also need more work and more knowledge on that, basically. Other climate tipping points can be considered as well. So it's not only ice sheets, there could be others, such as the weakening of the AMOC, so the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, how that will affect as well sea level for Europe, feedback loops on greenhouse gases, so potentially related, for instance, to the sinks of carbon in the ocean, on land, but also permafrost, for instance, and that could feed back on the emission. And regarding knowledge gaps, sorry, the second.
No, please.
Yeah. So regarding knowledge gaps, there are several as well. One of them is related to extreme sea levels, because it appeared that we need more information on that. And for that, we also need to better understand how extreme sea levels will change, and not only because of mean sea level rise, but also because drivers of extreme sea levels will change in the future. That is tides, that is storm surges, waves, nonlinear interactions between them, interactions between fluvial discharges and sea level itself. Then we heard several times about the need for more regional projections. So that would mean getting downscaled projection at a more regional scale to get refined information on how sea level will evolve in the future for those regions. And ice sheets again, I guess, but I already mentioned that.
Yeah, so quite a few elements really that will play into these this particular equation. Thank you very much for your clarifications. And clearly you've already, I mean, we've talked about knowledge gaps and we've talked about the projections, but they all have an impact, and they're all going to have quite a few consequences. And sea level rise in general does have already consequences. And I'd like Roderick to take us through some of those impacts and consequences that have already been touched upon, but a little more in depth. Good morning, Roderick.
Hi, thank you very much. I will share my screen. Okay, thank you very much for giving the time to address this impact point, which I think is very important, but which will also show that life is even more uncertain than already only from the sea level rise, because it's not just sea level rise which plays an important role for the impacts.
Roderick, you are in the presentation mode. Swap display probably would work.
Roderick, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, sorry.
I'll try it again. Does it help?
No, it worked in the beginning, but then it switched.
So it's okay like this?
Well, if you could make it into full screen. You should have a button somewhere at the bottom of your screen to show it in, yes,
This should be nearly full screen, right?
Yeah, no, but I mean, we shouldn't see the slides on the left. We should see
Yeah.
only the screen, and
Yeah,
normally
but if I-
it's in slide mode,
Roderick,
slideshow.
Roderick, if you are now there, look on the top left, there is swap display. There are 2 arrows on the top left of your screen. Not there, where you were before. In the second screen, somebody is saying, Jérôme is suggesting.
I
There
think
we
this is-
are. That's perfect. Thank you. That's it.
Let's see whether this works.
Yes,
This is not my screen, I think, what you see now.
as long as it works.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
So there are, I think, as mentioned already, 3 different impacts which are relevant for Europe, which is coastal and compound flooding, coastal erosion, and saltwater intrusion. And I think there are different drivers, and that is what complicates life even more than just considering sea level rise, and also leads to more uncertainty in the whole discussion. And that is why it is very difficult to discuss impacts really on a basin-wide scale. And that's one of the reasons, at least. And the other one is, of course, that impacts are usually very localized, and that holds for coastal flooding, but that also holds for the other impacts we have in Europe. And drivers for coastal flooding are sea level rise and storms. But I think the most interesting point, in fact, is the fact that we get now in a stage where we have models which can really calculate compounding events. And that is very important because most of the impacts are not just by a single driver, but they are a combination of different processes which are changing over time. And the accuracy of models is now getting large enough that we can try to address these compounding events and thereby make a step from what is known from the science to what is needed by the stakeholders. And one of these studies is in fact shown here, which we report on in the chapter, where you see the change in the coastal and compounding events. And I think the essential point is just that you see that the colors are moving from what is present day the case to what is the projected change. And you see that the differences in the impact of coastal flooding vary, first of all, from place to place. It varies in time, and it is very strongly scenario dependent. And the uncertainties in this kind of projections are still large, but we are getting there. And I'm pretty sure that in the next report, this can be provided with much more detail. For coastal erosion, there is also more than just one driver which plays an important role, and it has also very different impacts. It's not just habitat loss, but also increased flood risk, and it has consequences for tourism. So impacts are also itself very widely varying. And that means that adaptation strategies are very place dependent and context dependent. And if you look to the erosion as we see it now in projections, then you can clearly see that there's quite some land loss projected for the high end scenarios. This is for RCP 8.5, 2100. We have about 2,500 squared kilometer of land loss. And it's clear that in the second half of the century, the uncertainty is strongly related to the sea level rise. Maybe in the early part of the century, it may be still depending on wave climate changes, but in the second part of the century, it's more depending on sea level rise. On salinization, I think it is a kind of an upcoming realization of this problem. And this plays a role because of sea level rise again, not just sea level rise, but also reduced river flow plays a role in increased salinization issues. And it has impacts for freshwater loss, soil and crop damage, drinking water. So it also has a variety of problems where the salinization plays a role. And there is also a variety of solutions possible for salinization issues, ranging from flood barriers to aquifer recharge and sustainable groundwater management. So I think it is kind of an increasing realization for this saltwater intrusion, and it already plays a role at several places across Europe. It's very localized often, and that makes it kind of difficult to generalize also. So I think that is in the end, the bottom line of the impact chapter is that the variations of the impacts is very large and the variations of the sources is very large. And also the strategy to mitigate the problems which are arising from this are very widely different from place to place. That's what I wanted to tell you.
Thank you very much, Roderick. And why? I mean, clearly the impacts are mapped very much in detail. Why is it important to map them in such detail?
Yeah, I guess that is important because that is what, in the end, the people who have to adapt to the problems have to know. In a way, nobody is interested in the global mean sea level rise because that is not what they experience in their local condition. They have a local sea level rise, and they also have, in addition, maybe that the precipitation is changing. So the problems they suffer from are a combination of physical changes. So they really need to have much more than just sea level rise, and that complicates life of the practitioners, of course. But what you see is that the gap between science and practitioners is gradually slowing. I think the biggest advance of the AR6 report, if I may say, is that we now have much more information on extremes. And that is very useful because that brings science closer to practitioners.
Very good. And that's actually indeed, as we mentioned in the beginning, one of the goals of this particular report, to bring science to practice. Thanks a lot, Roderick. And just a reminder to everybody that Roderick is also going to be there for further questions about the most important impacts of sea level rise in Europe. So feel free to send your questions in the Q&A function rather than in the chat function. So these consequences, these impacts require quite a lot of adaptation measures, and they also require decision-making and decision-making principles on which to rely. And I'd like to turn to Julia to take us through that particular aspect. Good morning, Julia.
Good morning, Florence. Good morning, everyone. Let me share my screen. Okay. Okay, first of all, thank you. Thank you again, and good morning. So, sea level rise in Europe, adaptation measures and decision-making principles. So I would like to, first of all, acknowledge the contribution of our key lead authors, and in particular, Elisa Fiorini-Beckhauser and Sandy Bizarro, together with the number of contributing authors, Johan Inkel, Rebecca Biancardi-Aleu, Pierpaolo Campostrini, Maria Florencia Casas, Oceane Spen, and Athanasios Vaffeidis. So, okay. So just to give you, first of all, a snapshot of the table of contents of this chapter on adaptation measures and decision-making principles, as you can see also from the title, basically it's constituted of two main parts. So after the introduction, the section 2 and the subsections present the state-of-the-art of sea level rise adaptation measures in Europe and aim to provide guidance for the design and implementation of adaptation policies in the European basins. The section is complemented by a series of in-depth analyses showcasing the implementation of adaptation measures in different places. We have cases in Venice, in Aveiro, Portugal, and into the Wadden Sea. The subsequent section is on and subsections is a constituted overview of decision science terminology, and we presented the key aspects that need to be considered in coastal adaptation decision making, together with the explanation of some tools. So, okay, the objectives of the chapter is somehow twofold. First of all, we provided a catalog of adaptation measures in European basins to guide the design and the implementation into the different basins. This was an effort, I mean, our intention was to facilitate also the diversification of local and national adaptation strategies portfolio for decision makers. And we found that it was needed also to collect and discuss the different coastal adaptation measures currently implemented into the European basins. And then we found also important also to provide somehow a categorization and following important frameworks such as the one defined by the IPCC, first of all, but also a categorization defined by the European Environmental Agency. And the second objective of the chapter is to present approaches that can be suitable for supporting coastal adaptation decision making, addressing the deep uncertainty. So in doing we aim to fill a little bit the research gap within the coastal adaptation strategy landscape, and try to provide also new reflections and also highlight some shortcomings in terms of existing adaptation measures. As an overview, adaptation strategies on European coast basically are constituted by a mix of hard and soft measures, including the latter ones, including planning exercise, policy developments, and also, and first of all, stakeholder and community engagement. We found also a combination of traditional engineering solutions with soft measures, so including nature-based solutions, again with a strong integration of local communities into decision-making processes, and also strengthening an emphasis on the importance of continuous monitoring and flexible management strategies. It has to be recognized that the context, the decisions, and in general experiences with coastal adaptation vary considerably across all the regions and across places. And this is true in terms of scientific information that are considering also the time horizons for decision that is considered, and also the scale of investment. And another important aspect also, the risk acceptance preferences of decision makers and of their constituencies. Just to let's say recap, the main findings from this exercise is that all European countries are struggling and somehow are also advancing in adapting to sea level rise and in planning to sea level rise adaptation in order to enhance their coastal resilience. So we recognize a shift in strategy. So with this emphasis on the combination of gray engineering solutions, technical solutions with nature-based approaches, with community involvement and adaptive management methods. And in terms of decision-making consideration, it is recognized the importance to have flexible and low-regret strategies that basically are able to keep future adaptation options open in order to, let's say, met this uncertainty and the long-term horizons for implementation. It has been already mentioned by Bart, this table one, as we call. We can see that this was one of our, let's say, major effort. Basically, we come up with 17 adaptation measures to sea level rise, focusing on the different European sea basins. We consider the 4 climate impacts, so coastal flooding, saltwater intrusion, coastal erosion, and impacts on ecosystems and estuaries. And we structured our table and in order to provide, first of all, of course, the list of the identified measures, but also to provide information on the IPCC main type of response, so accommodate, protect, advance, and retreat. Then we categorize the measures according the EA framework. The EA framework is considering 5 key type of measures and as a subtype, 11 subtypes. So just to facilitate, we consider only the subtype level of governance and institutional measures, economic and finance, physical and technological options, nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based approach, and knowledge and behavioral changes. Again, key findings from our literature review. So accommodate measures are the most widely discussed. Those are followed by protect measures and then advance and finally retreat. The most common key type of measures is the one related to management and planning, followed by the ones discussing gray, green, and blue options, insurance and risk sharing instruments, and other technological options. There is a difference also in terms of knowledge and availability of information in terms of sea basins. So the sea basins most covered in the literature are the Eastern Atlantic, then the Mediterranean Sea, and then North Sea and Baltic Sea, with very few information on the Arctic Sea. In terms of impacts, the coastal flooding and erosion is absolutely the most treated, let's say, addressed, while studies and these on ecosystem, estuaries, and saltwater intrusion are very scarce. And in this sense, we are very, of course, we are finding the same shortcoming that have been already highlighted by the previous speakers. This is the snapshot. So as you can see, under the accommodate response, we have a catalog of nine of our adaptation measures that are falling under this accommodate response. I just recall you that for accommodate, we consider measures that are involving the preparing for and responding to coastal hazards. So they include a range of responses such as early warning systems, building flood-proof structures, but also managing the groundwater or implementing insurance and policy instruments. So as you can see, there is a wide variety of adaptation measures still falling under the accommodate response type. The second one, well covered, is the protect category. And as protect measures, we consider measures actually aiming to reduce the risk and to reduce the impacts of coastal hazards due to sea level rise through the construction of hard defense, but also of soft defense. So natural or ecosystem-based adaptation measures are also considered here protect measures. With the advanced category, basically we categorize one, raising and advancing coastal land. So basically a strategy dealing with, for example, creation of new raised ports or raising urban embankments, or creating, in that sense, vegetated areas to promote a natural land growth. So again, we considered here also green and gray options.
Julia, I'm sorry, can I please ask you to wrap up so that we can have time for questions as well, please?
Yes, sure. So the very last is just a very, very quick overview on the case studies on the World Heritage Sites of the Wadden Sea, just to give you also an example of in-depth review. This is a very interesting case of impacts of sea level rise threatening a World Heritage sites. It's the largest unbroken intertidal ecosystems. It spans between Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands, and with the enormous impacts in the future. Unfortunately, there is a lack of adaptation planning for the entire region, due, of course, to the complexity related to the nature of the site, but also to the fact that there is the involvement of 3 countries. So there are a few strategies in place. For example, we mentioned the adaptation plan, the German adaptation plan of the Schleswig-Holstein region, and we are highlighting the urgent need for a development of a transnational adaptation plan. So, thank you.
Thank you, Julia. A quick question. You mentioned literature review as one of the methodologies that you used in order to compile your catalogue of adaptation measures. Did you use any other means to manage to make this compilation as complete as possible?
Yeah, basically it was the literature review. It was an iterative mixed method approach. So it was we reviewed 247 scientific paper, reports, policy document, and other gray literature. So we started with reviewing scientific papers, but then from the Web of Science, but then we realized that we had to add the gray literature, so including national strategies, regional strategies, but also strategies at city level. And we counted more than 40 documents. Then we also had to include, so it was an iterative process, include sectoral reports and documents, for example, the maritime spatial planning, country information, and then also additional scientific studies. But we focus on the most recent one, and especially the ones that most probably were not being included into the previous IPCC assessment report.
Thank you. All these decision-making principles and these measures closely tie on to governance issues, and I'd like to now invite Sandy to present the governance context and the challenges that entices. So Sandy, please, good morning.
Good morning, good day. Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for this opportunity to present on the governance challenges. So let me also share my screen. I think that's looks like it's in working order. Yeah, so great. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm Sandy Bizarro. And yeah, pleased to present the assessment report chapter on governance, context, and challenges. As Florence has said, this follows up very nicely on the chapter on measures, because of course we're now thinking about the sort of governance structures and institutions that need to be in place to implement some of these measures and to make progress on adapting to sea level rise. So just to give a bit of overview of what we've done in this chapter, what are the objectives for reviewing or for developing this chapter on assessing governance of sea level rise in Europe. So of course, we're in a complex governance domain. Dealing with the governance of sea level rise requires policies that integrate across multiple scales, so time scales, of course, as we've heard here, but also different levels of governance, different spatial scales, and of course, across different sectors and domains. And that gives rise to different challenges and complexities. And so what we've set out for ourselves in this chapter is to look at an assessment of progress on coastal policies that address sea level rise across the sea basins, but largely focused on, of course, national entities as sort of, yeah, a key policy-making entity. And then looking at governance structures, also the financial arrangements for funding coastal adaptation and decision-making in the different sea basins, and then looking at how governance structures and governments are addressing the different challenges that arise for addressing sea level rise, particularly looking at how can we ensure equitable and inclusive approaches to sea level rise governance. So I'm not going to be able to cover everything that we've done in that chapter, but just to give some insight and the flavor on what we've been able to do to address each of those objectives. So here is starting from sort of looking at that assessment of progress. What we've done is looked at national coastal policy frameworks in each of the countries. As I've said, of course, focusing on national approaches is important. Starting point for policy. So looking then in each of the basins at country approaches to coastal adaptation policy, whether a strategy's been adopted for adaptation, whether lists of measures have been developed, and whether those measures actually account for or address sea level rise. One can look at into those policy documents and assess that. That's what we've done. Similarly, we've done something similar for the marine spatial planning frameworks. Again, looking at enforcement mechanisms for that, whether those are in place, and whether those actually then also use information and develop measures to address sea level rise. So it will be difficult, of course, in this setting to go through all of those countries, but yeah, I encourage you to go to the report for that analysis. Another thing we've done, as I've mentioned, we've looked at sort of emerging approaches and solutions for addressing governance complexity and challenges across the sea basins. So those different types, there are different types of challenges that arise with respect to sea level rise. I've mentioned already the time horizon and uncertainty challenge, so long-term impacts, but also benefits of adaptation, and then uncertainty associated with those presents challenges for governance. Similarly, integrating multiple scales, but also multiple uses and domains, coordinating that at different governance scales is another challenge. And then as I've mentioned, sort of the equity and social vulnerability issues that arise in adaptation. We've looked at and surveyed sort of the literature and landscape for innovative solutions to addressing those different challenges, and brought those together with several examples in the assessment chapter. I'll just show one of those. I mean, for reasons of time, This is an example from Italy, from the Ravenna municipality vision for 2100. So this is an example of addressing these sort of cross-scale and cross-domain coordination challenges through a co-development approach. So the municipality working with the scientific community to develop or co-develop a sort of scenario-based approach to look at and vision different adaptation measures for adapting to sea level rise, and then using that engagement process to develop a planning process. So here, the scientific community has developed these scenarios on that sort of represent two extremes of how adaptation could be addressed through rigid conservation, so reinforcing existing defenses, versus a more dynamic, evolving approach, if you want, managed retreat and habitat shifts. And that can sort of be visualized, as we show here, through these different visioning processes that manifest each of these different approaches. And through consultations, the municipality of Ravenna has been able to then develop their coastal resilient plan that takes on these different aspects and also builds in flexibility to deal with that. We have other examples in the assessment report. I just want to highlight that there's different emerging approaches around Europe to addressing some of these challenges. Then the last bit of sort of insight into what we've done in the chapter, I want to show this this table that illustrates a sort of survey of those equity and social vulnerability challenges that emerge with respect to different types of adaptation responses. So what this table shows is our different protect, advance measures, accommodate, and retreat measures to addressing sea level rise, and what are the justice implications of each of those types of measures. So we may have sort of distributive justice issues. So how do the costs and benefits of those different measures get distributed amongst different stakeholders? But we may also have procedural justice issues. So to what extent are different stakeholders involved in the decision-making processes and implementation around those issues? And if I just take an example of protection measures, often sort of the distributive issues that arise there is that they often protect high density areas, whereas and sort of lock in investments in high value areas, whereas less densely populated, less valuable areas, rural areas, are less protected. This is a well-known issue, and then are as a result underprotected, and we have those distributional issues to address there. Similarly, coastal asset owners tend to have power in those decision-making processes and can influence some of those decision-making processes around coastal protection decisions. And so what we've done is highlight each of those issues for the different measures that are involved, and then survey the literature and bring out some cases that show how those are being addressed around the different sea level or sea basins in Europe. I think given the time, that's what I want to show in terms of the insights of those that chapter. It does cover a lot of ground, but I hope that gives some insight into what we've developed there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'd like to look at the financing aspect, because it is clearly a key element in the governance and the implementation processes. So what trends have you observed for financing measures in the various European sea basins?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, so one thing, that is consistent across what we've observed in terms of policy approaches, as well as financing approaches, is diversity amongst different countries, across basins, but also within basins. And you got a feeling for that on the policy table that I showed in terms of countries being very different to the extent that they have measures in sea level rise addressed in their coastal adaptation policy frameworks. With financing, we see a similar diversity. So you have on the one hand, very centralized approaches to financing coastal adaptation. The Netherlands is a key example here. But you also have sort of, on the other hand, diverse or decentralized approaches where a lot more responsibility for municipalities the financial responsibility for funding adaptation is sort of devolved to municipalities. The UK, also Germany on the Baltic Sea coast is an example of that. And then we have sort of hybrid arrangements in Italy, for example. And so we see a lot of diversity between different basins and different countries. And this has sort of positives and negatives. We have the ability to implement coastal adaptation and raise funds in a centralized approach with more ease. But as sea level rise increases, then that can also test sort of the social solidarity and the cross-funding that we have from coastal areas to non-coastal areas. So that will put these financial arrangements under pressure. And we've sort of reviewed some of the implications of that. So yeah, long story short, diversity between centralized and decentralized approaches.
Thank you very much. Time to switch to the questions that you have all sent, and we do have quite a few. So I hope that we're going to have time to answer most of them, at least. And the first question I have here is for you, Jose. It follows what you presented in terms of knowledge gaps. And the question is, could you expand on what respondents mean when they refer to flexibility in adaptation plans?
So thank you for the question. So when we ask about to classify the flexibility of the adaptation plans is to assess where the system plans are adaptive or not. So then if the conditions are changing during the lifetime of the plan, so are they flexible to adapt to the new conditions, or they are very rigid that they are not able to adapt to the new conditions? For instance, if I build a seawall, so the seawall is not flexible to adapt to different things. So then the idea is, if the plans are considering during all the lifetime of the impact of sea level rise, that is a very long time, so in all the timeline, is the plan able to be modified to adapt to the new conditions? So then this was our question. And the people apparently answered that no, they have a plan, but most of the plan are not flexible to changing conditions. And this is a problem when we are thinking a very long time scale.
Indeed. Thank you. Roderick, I have here a couple of questions for you actually related to the impacts that you mentioned. And the first question is about coastal erosion. Is coastal erosion a sea level rise impact? And is sea level rise a first or a second order driver of erosion? And can we say anything sensible about how erosion scales with sea level rise? So it's 3 questions in one.
Yeah, that's a complicated question, which I guess does not have a single answer either. It depends very much on the locality where you consider it. It plays a role, but whether it's the primary driver of the sea level rise, that is definitely not everywhere the case. That complicates the discussion on impacts, but nevertheless, it is a driver of changes in erosion. So I think the local context is extremely important in this question.
Mm-hmm.
And also the timing, of course.
Yeah. And I have another question for you. Does your map of coastal erosion forecasted by SLR include also longshore transport in addition to cross-shore transport?
I don't think we can answer that question in so much detail at the moment.
Thank you. Well, at least that's clear. So short and to the point answer. Thank you. The next question is more for you, Julia, I think. Does the assessment of coastal flooding take into account the riverine discharge, and local precipitation in addition to the SLR? And second part to that question, for extreme events like storm surge, my impression is that the rain associated with the storm surge contributes very significantly to the coastal inundation, adding to the contribution from SLR and surge level. So please share your views on this.
I'm afraid this is not a question for me, but it's a question for people addressing impacts. And,
I can say a little on it.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, in the presentation, I had one slide actually addressing this. And yes, it is very often the compounding effect of extremes like increased precipitation and very high sea level, and then the temporal expression of the sea level, not the trend in the sea level, which cause the impact. So yes, this is considered. At the same time, if it is about precipitation, I think we have to be realistic that projections in changes in the extremes in precipitation are pretty uncertain. It's very different from a projection in sea level, in the mean sea level trend, on which we have a lot of confidence, but projections in the change in precipitation is more uncertain. So we usually, in fact, capture the effect on the compounding event caused by the change in the mean trend of the sea level rise rather than in a change of the precipitation extremes.
Would somebody else like to add something to this maybe from another point of view, from another angle? I mean, feel very free, if you want to intervene on any of the questions, actually, because it's not always obvious who they're directed at, but if somebody else would like to add their comments on one of the questions, feel free. The next one is also partly for you, Rodrigue, but I'm going to start with Angelique because it also talks about, or it also refers to adaptation measures. So, Angelique, the question, it's a long question. So, an average global SLR of 3 millimeters per year over 30 years does not impress anyone, but storm surges of compound, land and sea, are dramatic and tragic. How can we get more interaction and coordination between hydrologists, hydrogeodesists, and coastal oceanographers to tackle better compound surge extreme events? So more cooperation, a broader cooperation, maybe?
Okay, yeah, thank you. First to start with the relatively perceptibly slow rates of sea level rise, let's say, of 3 meter, 5 millimeter per year, it's still important to keep in mind that although that doesn't seem a lot, it accumulates over time, and also mean sea level. So those changes, those 20 centimeter changes over the last century, for instance, are key drivers in the changes in extreme sea levels, actually. So this rise, slowly building up, is also driving much changes in extreme sea levels that are themselves driving lots of impacts, as we could see. Then regarding the compound events, I think this is a very much developing field that we touched on in the report, and Rodrigue discussed that. So the literature has been growing quite a lot on this topic over the few years, with first more local studies. So maybe that's easier in that case to get the collaboration between the different fields because it's very localized. But we've seen also that it's developed towards more pan-European or even some global studies as well. And I think that for what it takes, sea level rise science is very much multidisciplinary science, as we saw with the contribution of ocean circulations and the surges and the tides. And then we have also the ice sheets and the glaciers, etc., etc. or the type of observation that we use, or the types of tools that we use, including models, tag gauges, satellite altimetry. So there is a high chance that we can as well bring in the hydrologist to get and answer this question. But it's true that I think that right now, regarding compound flooding, we do not yet take into account all the ingredients that will lead to compound flooding. So we have studies focused on surges and precipitations, or surges and river discharge, but it's yet to be done to really integrate everything under the same framework to really get this answer of compound flooding. So that also asks for methodological developments, I guess.
Thank you. Roderick, would you like to add anything on that particular aspect?
No, I think Angelique gave a right answer, complete.
Thank you. We have yet another question. It's more of a comment, but you're very welcome to comment on the comment. If anyone wants to comment, yes, welcome. What is generally missing is the capacity to combine the analysis of sea level rise impacts in terms of sea flooding, and that, I guess, the impact related to the shore dynamic due to, sorry, I have a loss here. Yes, due to the lack of sediment input. Nadia, you're nodding. Would you like to add something on that particular aspect, maybe?
Yeah, I'd like to add a general statement before the specific on sediments. But the general statement is that we are in an age of change, and the complexity and the compounding that we are talking about is going to be solved in a very different way in the future, which means that it will be solved with machine learning, better data. So we need to concentrate on observations that would help our machine learning. I think we haven't discussed this. This is a missing part in the too much into the future. In fact, there are already evidence that in scientific papers that complexity cannot grow exponentially to the level that we are advising here, considering the hydrology and the precipitation and the atmospheric and the earth system at scales of 100 meters, because that's what we are advocating, but plus the sediments. So I think that what we should say is, let's look at the new techniques and evolve very fast, and especially look at new data sets that can really help machine learning to get that complexity unraveled for us. So my hope is that this report, which has taken so much attention, is showing the complexity, and then the future issues should be solved in a different way. Thank you.
Thank you. My next question is for Julia. Julia, you mentioned estuaries and coast previously when you made your presentation. In the case of the Wadden Sea case study, how far in the estuary and tidal Elbe River does the study go back into land? I.e., does it go all the way back to Hamburg, or is it just the coast?
Okay, to be honest, I mean, I think this is this question is better to be addressed to the authors of the this in-depth review, which is Athanasios Vaffedis. I would say that is we are referring to the coast, and we are not arriving to the city of Hamburg. But really, that would be a question to be addressed to the author of the box. So, as I replied also in the chat, it would be I will ensure that this question will be properly answered by Nassos.
Very good. Thank you for that. The person who asked the question can actually reach out to him.
Yes, yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Thanks. The next question is related to the chapter on adaptation measures, but everyone else is also welcome to answer or to comment or to add something to the answer. But can we put more efforts and more investments to protect our coasts by using wave energy converters to damp the destructing energy of coastal waves and incidentally convert that energy into electricity? And then the person adds, incidentally, because producing electricity from wave energy converters is not yet profitable. Hundreds of billions will be spent in protection of our coasts. So who'd like to pick up on that? Adaptation measures, Angélique, maybe, or?
Oh, no, I'm not a specialist on adaptation itself, but for sure, everything breaking wave energy will help protect the coast. And we have nature-based solutions to do that as well, such as seagrass for Europe, for instance, or coral reef for some islands, etc. But then on the co-benefit of using the dissipation of wave energy to produce electricity, I cannot answer that type of question.
I can imagine that's not exactly linked to the report, but if anybody has a comment, yes, Nadia, please.
Here is the opinionated one, me. Yeah, from my reading of the literature, my experience, I find this very unlikely to occur. I must say that if I would have to advise for diminishing the energy of the waves, I would use nature-based solutions or gray solutions like they were discussed. The size of the events that we are talking about, which is taking sometimes up to a kilometer in the coastal area, makes it very difficult to have mobile structures and being sufficiently covering the area of impact. So, but we never want to completely discourage. It seems to me that nature-based solutions, gray solutions, and looking at as it was said, really looking at the compound effects in a novel way would be much better for finding solutions and more fruitful and resilient and construct resilient communities. Sorry for.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for answering that. We have another question here, and it's more of a general question. So anybody with an opinion on this or more information is very welcome to answer. What happens in case of Antarctic shelf instability and melting happens very fast? What would be the consequences for shoreline areas in European sea basins? Who'd like to pick up on this? Nadia? Who are you pointing at?
Roderick.
I suspected. Yeah, well, that's pretty straightforward in the sense that all mass which is on land, which will be added to the ocean, will in the end lead to sea level rise. And that will be, if it is from Antarctica, roughly 25% more than the volume which is added in the ocean. So it will be equal across Europe, more or less. And yeah, the rate is very poorly constrained at the moment. But the example given by the question is that first the ice shelves have to collapse. And the idea is that this does not happen before the end of this century. That's the current understanding.
Well, I'll stay with you, Roderick, for the next question, because I think it's also for you. Is wave climate treated, especially in connection with extreme sea levels impact?
Well, I think what we should not forget is that most of the things we are discussing here are, and that came in an earlier question also, they're based on climate models, and a lot of the impacts require also other types of models, like the hydrodynamical models or wave models in combination with the climate model. And this combination, which Nadia wants to solve with machine learning, is not really done a lot. So there are studies, but very limited number of studies where they combine wave climate and climate models, or climate models and hydrodynamical models. It is done, but not very much. And it is really needed for local impacts.
Thank you. I'd like to, the next one is not a question, it's actually a comment, but I think it summarizes a lot of the views from all our viewers. Is congratulations on the launch of this excellent report. Then there's a question. Can the authors comment on how the limits of adaptation may vary between soft or nature-based based adaptation and hard adaptation options? Which option should we go for, and maybe why?
Yeah, maybe I can say something on that. So it is one of the trends is to carefully consider the so-called green and blue adaptation options instead of gray, even if all adaptation options have trade-off. Let's say really that should be considered when planning. So it's very difficult to say which is the best one in, let's say, in general. What is important to consider is hybrid solutions can also place and also can provide interesting, let's say, answers to a specific problem. It's also important also to underline, and according, this was, let's say, shortcoming that we found in our research, is the lack of literature on effectiveness and feasibility of adaptation measures in specific cases. So this is exactly because what I wanted to point out is that the diversity of context, the diversity of the regions and places, and the diversity of measures, it's very difficult to be assessed without empirical studies. So empirical studies are very much important, and actually there is a lack on this.
Thank you. And this is now going to be my final question, because we're going to have to wrap up afterwards. But on the same chapter of adaptation measures, have you observed any limits or trade-offs of adaptation measures in Europe?
Yes, as I was saying before, for example, accommodate measures can offer immediate, let's say, benefits. As you remember, the accommodate categories was the wider ones, encompassing the diversity of measures spanning from gray, but also planning exercise or early warning systems. So, but sometimes, and those can be also cost effective. And but sometimes the financial cost of implementing some of those measures can be a challenge for some communities, while measures dealing with protection, immediate protection, can provide an immediate important risk reduction, but they can also lead to disruption of the coastal processes, and so basically leading to several problems in terms of the capability of the systems to provide ecosystem services. And the same is also for soft protection measures. So it's not only a question of hard protection measures, and also in terms of the one in terms of advance. And of course, it's also very immediate to understand the trade-off when considering measures dealing with the retreat, so the displacement of communities, or even the displacement of some let's say, facilities, for example. So those can have implications also in terms of justice, so justice considerations, but also in terms of the possibility to lose also the value of some community. So, I mean, for each of them, there are problems that should be considered. And again, we really need to enhance studies, empirical studies, in order to provide better insights and comprehensive pictures of those measures.
Thank you very much, Julia. So you're going to have the final word in these answers. But thank you all for joining us. Just a few points before we actually wrap up. First of all, a reminder of something that I mentioned at the very beginning, the fact that the report is published in the journal State of the Planet, and you can find a link to that publication in the chat as we speak if you want to copy it and check it later on. Also, if you are going to attend the COP29 in Baku next week, you should look out for the presentation of the Sea Level Rise Assessment Report in the German, Italian and Spanish pavilions. So there will be specific presentations, and you can find more information in the chat as well. And I am pretty sure quite a few of you are going to be in Baku next week. Finally, we will publish a summary brochure for policymakers, like Bart presented in the beginning of our webinar. And it will be a standalone publication because of the specific format it has, and because of the key messages that are in it, particularly targeting policymakers. It will be published after the seminar, and it will be shared with you at the beginning of next week. So look out for that particular brochure and make sure you disseminate it to the right people. It needs to get out to policymakers as much as possible. But thank you all very, very much. Thanks to all our speakers for their very interesting, very clear contributions to the discussion. Thanks for being with us this morning, and congratulations indeed on the great work and the very, very interesting and comprehensive reports. I'll give you the floor in just a second, Nadia. I'd like to thank also all of you joining us with this event online, because we did have quite a lot of people following us throughout, and you did stick to the end, which is always a good sign in terms of contributions from our speakers. Nadia, a quick word from you?
Yes, I'd like to thank a lot the Secretariat of JPI Oceans and JPI Climate. And my particular thank is to Petra and Torsten, who have really driven us to this amazing achievement, and Lavinia and Kanika and Michael. They have been an essential component of this adventure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadia. Indeed, I'm sure they all appreciate it, and very well-deserved thanks and congratulations to them as well. So this is a wrap. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you all. And let's hope for the best and the widest dissemination of this report. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Florence.